Hi, I'm Stephanie, and today I am comfy. This is Art History Storytime. This is a segment I like to call Glimpse the Context. Today we're talking about Benedetto Silva, a human who was treated as a spectacle and living oddity, but through the two portraits made of him, we're able to gain a sense of who he was, and possibly even recapture his dignity. To this day, Port Livorno is one of the largest Italian seaports located on the northwestern Italian coast. And in the mid-17th century, it too was a bustling trade stop. For some context, Italy in the 1600s was still experiencing the waves and effects of the Renaissance, which began roughly in the 1400s. But the once golden and exciting Rinascimento era was phasing out, and instead war, plague, and migration were causing a real rough patch for the Italian peninsula, a dark age, a crisis. Despite these commoner problems, the European courts still raged on in all their wealth and superiority. The court of Cosimo III, the Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, was one such place. Cosimo III was described as tyrannical, superstitious, weak, and bigoted. Basically, he was a mean little bitch with a big ego. He had these crazy, rigid moral standards for everyone. They were high expectations, almost seemingly designed to make people fail so that he could punish them. But, of course, he was a total hypocrite himself. They usually are. It was through Port Livorno that the newly baptized Benedetto Silva came through to be gifted to the court of Cosimo III, like some kind of African souvenir. Trade was vibrant by land and by sea for its time. Treasures circulated through Europe from the Near and Far East, and the Americas, and Africa. There was the usual inventory of precious metals and spices and silks and domestic and undomesticated animals, but there was also human trafficking. And within the slave trade was a niche market for purchasing other humans with genetic anomalies. I'm talking dwarfs, giants, bearded ladies, albinos, and the like. These people were not bought to do manual labor, but rather collected and displayed like a rare Pokemon card. While I don't want to get into judging the past through the lens of today, I think we can all agree that it was still slavery. These human rarities were still stolen from their homelands and owned by others. It was just a different style of slavery, where the outcome of your genetic lottery and your mere physical existence for the entertainment and spectating of others was your forced labor. The monarchs and wealthy aristocrats that owned these people took care of them financially and sometimes protected them in other ways, because they were such a novelty. Oh my god, I love my dwarf, I have like 10. But they were very much still slaves in the system. So this was the fate of Benedetto. He was kidnapped as a young boy from the country of Angola in Central Africa. We don't know his birth name or what his life was like before he was stolen. When he did end up in European hands, he was given a new name and labeled as a Christian convert before being gifted to the court of Cosimo III. As was typical of the colonization tactics of the day, one can only imagine what it would have been like to be in this situation, to be stolen and not know what your captors are going to do with you, and missing your family and not knowing if you're ever going to see them again. While we don't have a written record of his thoughts and feelings, his first portrait is so incredibly telling of his emotions. In this 1708 oil-on-canvas portrait of Benedetto, attributed to the painter Antoni Franchi, we get a lot of emotion. Just look at that sad gaze. It looks like he's about to cry. He's told to pose in this militaristic stance surrounded by props and clothing and landscape, which is meant to describe who he is and where he comes from. This is just my opinion, but I doubt the artist intended to paint him looking sad. But it didn't matter. Benedetto's state of being must have been so low that it would have permeated through to any viewer, in the present or hundreds of years later. Let's start with his clothes. The toga-like silk he wears is an iconographic outfit of the typical negretto da salotta, which literally translates into lounge negro. That's right, a black slave whose forced job it is to look nice for the parlor, to show off when guests come over. I know. The bows on his arm are part of the costume. They're a Rococo-style accessory popular at the time. The shells, the ships, the coastal landscape indicate his homeland on the African Atlantic coast. This was a way to say where he came from, because if you're commissioning a portrait of your rare collectible human, why wouldn't you show off the fact that he comes from some far-off, distant, exotic place? He holds a spear that bears his name and describes him as a white Moor from Angola, of black father and mother. This functions as something like a museum label. You want to organize your specimen collection, of course. And by the way, a Moor was known by Europeans in the Middle Ages as Muslims or anyone with dark skin from Africa. There were distinctions between black and white Moors, but not much else as far as cultural differentiations. So he was a white Moor with black parents. Years later, Benedetto sits for another portrait, this time by Domenico Tempesti Fiorentino. The vibe is very different. This pastel-on-paper depiction captures him dressed as a typical contemporary young man, with a posture and expression that is formal but relaxed. The solid dark background is efficient and to the point. He wears a simple but well-put-together outfit, not a costume this time. He's no longer the same anxious young boy, only one of many from the human display collection of Cosimo III's court. This is a decade's worth of transformation captured in two portraits. The way I see it, the second portrait makes up for the humiliation of the first. In the first, he's just been captured, and he wears his suffering on his sleeve. And while we don't really know what his days were like or how he was treated day to day, the second portrait gives this impression of someone with dignity and self-awareness. Someone who's seen some shit and gained some wisdom. Even someone who makes their own decisions and has some autonomy. Benedetto Silva pops up again 4 years later after his second portrait in a log stating that he was donating bedding to charity. I hope this means that he was living comfortably enough that he had extra to give. The following year, in 1723, there is a record of him participating in Cosimo III's funeral. Side note about Cosimo III, he died on October 31st after severely declining in health and suffering for about a month. Once he was gone on that faithful Halloween day, it was apparent just how much his political decisions had screwed over Tuscany and its people. Spooky. I wish we knew more about Benedetto Silva. I'm curious about what his life was like and how long he lived, but unfortunately much of his story has been lost to history. He himself has not been forgotten though, because here we are talking about him and wondering about him 304 years after his second portrait. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find these people and stories in history as interesting as I do. If you enjoyed this video, I'd deeply appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe for more art-related content.
We did it!